John Ashbery, the New York School, and Paris, poets and painters who were his friends. We have to ask ourselves first, is Ashbery a poet-artist or an artist-poet? An important work which you probably will not have time to read in entirety as students of Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror, but a work that suggests to you just how important art is for Ashbery. Do notice on the cover this painting by Jane Freilicher. First, though, some poets behind Ashbery's own poetry. Yeats, Stein, certainly, Pound, Eliot, Hilda Doolittle, perhaps, Edith Sitwell, maybe. Wallace Stevens, certainly, a very important influence. And William Carlos Williams, another extremely important influence. Of course, there were also the poets of the 1930s as just a contextual backdrop in poetry for Ashbery. Auden, McNeice, Spender, Lewis, Cummings, Moore, Bishop, Roykesser. Or the poets of the 1940s. Barker, Brooks, Eberhard, Eliot, Frost, Fuller, Gascoigne, Kavanaugh, Lowell, Shapiro, Schwartz, Thomas, and Thompson. But I want to focus more at this point on painters and painting, on the abstract expressionism and action painting that Ashbery was writing about in his early days as he started composing his own poetry. Mark Rothko, Willem de Kooning, Barnett Newman, Franz Klein, Jackson Pollock, Rudy Burkhardt, Joan Mitchell, and others. And this term New York, which was first used for avant-garde painters in or near New York City, and then John Myers called poets the New York School in 1961 in the California magazine Nomad. The name stuck, and then Myers' anthology, The Poets of the New York School, came out. Myers was co-owner of the Tibor and Nagy Gallery, which of course was instrumental in first publishing the New York poets. In the 1950s, these talented university graduate writers gathered with talented young painters, and what an opportunity for that gallery. So the painters of the 1940s, abstract expressionism and action painting, already mentioned that, and let's go to the next screen. Who were the poets and writers, and who were the painters that hung out at Tibor de Nagy, the gallery? Among the writers, you had Paul Goodman, Barbara Guest, Kenneth Koch, Frank O'Hara, John Ashbery, Kenward Elmsley, Harry Matthews, Joe Brainerd, and Bernadette Mayer. And among the painters, Fairfield Porter, Grace Hartigan, Neil Blaine, Larry Rivers, Mike Goldberg, and Jane Freilicher. Might I just suggest that you notice, especially on the list of writers, that there were two women, Barbara Guest and Bernadette Mayer. So, important to think about the fact that Ashbery's work was published alongside the work of other poets and also some artwork in periodicals such as Folder in 1954, and in Big Table number 3. So thinking about how little magazines were still very important. They had been important for the first avant-garde in modernist poetry, and they were again extremely important in this period when New York school poets were self-consciously aware that they were forming a new avant-garde. So among these New York poets, maybe a little time to speak about each individually. Kevin Cocke was born in Cincinnati and from a Jewish family and upbringing. He was drafted into World War II and served, and then attended Harvard on the GI Bill, which is where he met his fellow poets. After graduation from Harvard in 1948, he moved to New York City and obtained his doctorate from Columbia. During 1 year, he went to France on a Fulbright scholarship, rather like Ashbery, and the influence of French poetry can also be felt on his own work. He spent a year also as a teaching assistant in California. So he met Ashbery at Harvard, and Ashbery used Cocke's New York City apartment the summer after he graduated from Harvard. And that's where he also met his lifelong friend, the painter Jane Freilicher, because she lived in that same apartment building. In 1953, Cocke's poems, after Ashbery's in fact, appeared in an illustrated chapbook volume published by the Tibor-Nagy Gallery, so Co. or A Season on Earth, and his writing has been associated with stream of consciousness and dos passos, and he uses juxtapositions to create beauty in ways similar to William Carlos Williams or Saint-Jean Perse. And he integrated a comedy to lyric poetry. So he taught at Columbia University for over 40 years, and he also focused on workshops about writing for children and older adults. He won a Bulletin Prize for his collection One Train in 1994. Cocke suggested that one should not look for meaning in his work as readers did with the poetry of Eliot and Pound, and he said, I grew up in a time when T.S. Eliot was, as Delmore Schwartz said, the literary dictator of the West, and not only were you supposed to be serious, you were supposed to be a little depressed. All right, so obviously Cocke is writing in a kind of reaction against Eliot, and to some extent you might think Ashbery perhaps was also. Frank O'Hara was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and raised near Boston. He was from a blue-collar Irish Catholic family. His father was in business, and O'Hara himself went to the Navy and served in World War II. Also went to Harvard on the GI Bill, attending Harvard from 1947 to 1950. And then he received his BA in English and did his MA at the University of Michigan. He was friends with Ashbery from about 1948 on, and they were quite close friends, in fact. He had an early interest in Samuel Beckett and Jean Rhys, and then did a bit of reading on Williams, especially influenced by Patterson. He moved to New York City in 1951 and published A City Winter with the Tibor-Nagy Gallery. He published a book-length study of Jackson Pollock's painting in 1959 and was quite open about his homosexuality in his poetry. His poetry is influenced by abstract impressionist painting, by pulp culture, cinema, and interest in the civil rights movement as well as in jazz music. During the 1960s, he curated exhibits for the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and his sudden death in 1966, Lehman said, removed the group's dominant personality. So perhaps you might think destabilized the New York poets, but were they really a group as such? They were just friends who were all writing poetry and exchanging about their experience together, I think. to some extent, at least at that time. They've since been more or less fixed in cement as the New York poets. So O'Hara's non-manifesto of 1959, which has been classified as personism, included in the 1960 Allen anthology, reads, in part, quote, "I am mainly preoccupied with the world as I experience it. What is happening to me, allowing for lies and exaggerations which I try to avoid, goes into my poems. I don't think my experiences are clarified or made beautiful for myself or anyone else. They are just there in whatever form I can find them. What is clear to me in my work is probably obscure to others, and vice versa." This is Ashbery with O'Hara. I don't have a date for this photo right now, but a poem by O'Hara to John. I can't believe there's not another world where we will sit and read new poems to each other high on a mountain in the wind. You can be Tufu, I'll be Po Chui, and the monkey lady'll be in the moon, smiling at our ill-fitting heads as we watch snow settle on a twig. Or shall we be really gone? This is not the grass I saw in my youth, and if the moon when it rises tonight is empty, a bad sign, meaning you go like the blossoms. I don't know if you can see the Imagist influence on this poem, but if you study it, you may find Imagism there too. So O'Hara was the poet of his time who was most celebrated in New York City. His poetry is fairly readable and understandable, so even if you're new to poetry, it speaks to you. He wrote poetry anywhere and was known to type out a poem during a party. Mayakovsky helped him produce an intimate yell, thought Schuyler. Homage to him was paid at his funeral by many key figures of this time, poets especially. He had the ability to make things and people sacred, said Bill Bergson. Larry Rivers said, there were at least 60 people in New York who thought Frank O'Hara was their best friend. Allen Ginsberg recited Indian sutras over his grave, and Ashbery read one of O'Hara's poems at the funeral. Ginsberg, years later, said in an interview, and I think this is an important quote because it draws together New York and San Francisco in a way maybe people don't immediately see. They weren't such separate entities. There seemed to be some sort of alliance between the San Francisco open form people such as Snyder, Whalen, McClure, Olson, Creeley, Duncan, and the New York group of O'Hara, Schuyler, Ashbery. The common ground seemed to be admiration building on William Carlos Williams's American vernacular, idiomatic diction, and rhythm, and the spontaneous writing of Gertrude Stein. So Jimmy Schuyler, he was from Chicago. He lived in East Aurora in New York State as a teenager. So he lived in maybe a less urban environment. He studied architecture, history, literature, and joined the Navy. Discharged from the Navy, he moved to New York in 1944. He was Auden's personal secretary for several years and for 18 months approximately on the Italian island Ischia. He worked at a New York City bookstore while he shared an apartment with O'Hara and Ashbery. He was curator for the Modern Art Museum for a while, and he wrote for Art News, and he dabbled in theater as well. He was discreetly homosexual in real life, but very much out about his sexual preference in his poetry. He lived with Fairfield and Ann Porter for a few years in Southampton, maybe more than a few years, 12 years or so. And he collaborated with Ashbery on a novel, A Nest of Ninnies. This was a novel that was published many years after it was first begun, in 1969 or so. In 1972, he published a long poem, The Crystal Lithium, which depicted some of his own bipolar disorder, and Ashbery esteemed him as an ideal critic of poetry. In fact, about that same time, Morning of the Poem came out, won a Pulitzer Prize in 1980. During the last decade of his life, he suffered from poor health, and he lived more or less a secluded lifestyle at the Chelsea Hotel. In 1995, his collected poems were published posthumously. Bill Berkson was born in Manhattan, was the son of Jewish refugees. He earned his Bachelor of Arts from Brown University. His father died in 1959, and he started grad work at Columbia in social research, but then obtained his MA in Fine Arts from New York University. He was interested in Apollinaire, Whitman, Larka, Pasternak, Auden, Williams, O'Hara, Ashbery, and his collaborative writing projects with O'Hara helped establish his reputation. He edited O'Hara's poetry after his death. In 1971, he founded the magazine Big Sky and published in a publishing house also called Big Sky in Bolinas, California. In 2019, a Frank O'Hara notebook was published. Joe Brainerd, 1942 to 1994. Brainerd and Ashbery first met in 1963 at a party that O'Hara hosted for Ashbery. He illustrated Ashbery's The Vermont Notebook, published the same year as Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror. He was also one to work on collages, and he often sent or saved materials for Ashbery's collages. He would sometimes send them to Ashbery in the mail. Today he's considered among the second or third wave of New York school poets. Along with Ted Berrigan and Ron Padgett, they wrote together The Bean Spasms of 1967, relating the pop and literary scene of New York City in the 1960s. And one of the three even invented a fake interview with Ashbery, which was published in The World in 1967. David Shapiro, an even younger man, was from an artistic Jewish family in New Jersey. His grandfather was both a cantor and a composer. His father studied sculpture, and his mother was a musician. He was already an excellent violinist when he appeared on Voice of America at the age of 5. He published a poem when he was 16 in Poetry, Poetry Magazine of Chicago. And he earned his degrees in English through Columbia University. Ashbery first met him at that same party in August of 1963 that O'Hara hosted for him. His works include poems from Deal, A Man Holding an Acoustic Panel, The Page Turner, Lateness, and new and selected poems. In 2016, he published In Memory of an Angel. Harry Matthews, who died in 2017, was a poet, novelist, and translator of French. He was born in New York City, attended private schools, and then Princeton. He went to the war after being drafted into the Navy, and he later on finished his degree at Harvard. Meanwhile, he had an adventure with Niki de Saint-Phal, and he moved to Paris, studied conducting at the École Normale de Musique in Paris. So his adventure with Saint-Phal ended in 1960, and he took care of their 2 children, He co-founded with Ashbery and Schuyler and Koch the periodical Locus Solis, with the title bearing the title of a novel by Raymond Roussel. Roussel was a key influence on Matthews' writings in the early 60s, and Matthews became a member of the Oulipo group. I'm sure you've heard of Oulipo. He had a relationship with Maxim Grofsky, the editor of Paris Review, and many of his works at that time were published in the Paris Review. He also published poems and selected declarations of dependence. I see the italics are missing on the last line of this screen. Sorry about that. Voilà. Pierre Martory. This is where the influence for Ashbery is personal, and Martory was also a romantic partner for Ashbery. So all of Martory's life, to some degree, must have been in some way part of the backdrop, part of the context, and perhaps part of the influence for Ashbery. He was born in Bayonne with some Basque ancestry, and his early life was spent mainly in Morocco. He was a member of the French Free Forces during World War II, and he studied at Sciences Po in Paris. As a writer, he practiced the art of collage, and he was very interested in surrealism and humor. So he was Ashbery's partner for close to a decade, and he was admired by the other poets already mentioned from the New York School. No doubt he was an influence on Ashbery's work, and Ashbery also was an influence on his work. Ashbery has translated his poetry into English, and in the 1970s, he collaborated with Francis Wishart for Père Lachaise and Au Lac, au Lake. So this is Alex Katz's portrait of Pierre Martory, a portrait from perhaps the 1980s, and I'm not certain about the date. So now we shift to the painters and artists that were Ashbery's friends. First of all, Jane Freilicher. She was born in Brooklyn and completed her degree at Brooklyn College and then Columbia University, where she studied with the painter Hans Hofmann. She came of age as an artist during the time of abstract expressionism, and she had her first one-person exhibit at the Tiber-Denagi Gallery in 1952. She pursued her painterly realism for over 60 years, and her recognition grew with time. One of her traits is to depict flowers before a window, showing a cityscape. And these paintings were very appreciated by Ashbery, and they remained friends throughout their lives. So sometimes the flowers are in front of a countryscape rather than a cityscape, and the contrast is great. This painting, one of Freilich's paintings, was on the cover of Ashbery's book of art criticism that I showed you in the beginning, and it was also a portrait that hung in his New York apartment. My own feline is happy with this painting. Jane Freilicher later in life. Larry Rivers, born at Grossberg in the Bronx, son of Jewish immigrants then from Ukraine. He changed his name in 1940. He was a jazz saxophonist, and he studied at the Juilliard School of Music, where he met Miles Davis and remained Davis's friend until his death. He studied painting with Hans Hofmann, like Freilicher, in fact. In the early 60s, he lived at Hotel Chelsea along with Bob Dylan, Janis Joplin, Leonard Cohen, Dylan Thomas, Sid Vicious, and Andy Warhol's Factory People, so a whole group of people bubbling over. He was is considered a grandfather and godfather of pop art. His studios were in New York City, Southampton, Long Island, and Zihatueno, Mexico. French Money is the title of this painting, French Money 2 from 1962. It looks like a 100-franc bill redone. Here is his portrait of Frank O'Hara. Fairfield Porter was the fourth child of an architect and a poet, and he studied at Harvard. He painted landscapes and domestic interiors and portraits of John Ashbery, Frank O'Hara, and James Schuyler. His family's summer house in Maine was used as a setting for his painting. Rudy Burckhardt was a Swiss native, but born in the U.S., and so he also held American citizenship. While he was studying medicine in London, he became interested in photography and decided to take that up instead. So he went to New York in 1935, and he also traveled and photographed his way through Paris, New York, and Haiti before the 1930s ended. His second wife was painter Yvonne Jacquet, and apparently they collaborated closely together for a period of about 40 years. Holland Cotter, writing in the New York Times, called Burckhardt the poet's artist. He was close to Ashbery, Kenneth Koch, and Vincent Katz, and sometimes photographed them alongside their painter friends. Ashbery called his work a subterranean monument, so only one example of his work here for you now, but you can certainly find others on internet. So just this photo called Chelsea Escape 2, New York City, 1947. This photo, I think, an interesting one for us because it represents the city during the time of the New York School Poets. And, of course, these folks were all friends, so they more or less all knew about each other. Maybe there were some affinities making some friendships closer, of course, than others. But I'm sure most of the people I mentioned in this class among the artist group knew of each other. Joan Mitchell was born in Chicago and made a name for herself in the 1950s among the New York painters. But she began to make a home in Paris by the late 50s, and in 1968 set up her studio in Claude Monet's town, Véteuil. Many of her works are clearly influenced by Monet's painting, and, she's known for her grand abstract works, which focus on the perception of things within space. Things and space, sort of a kind of spatiality, is an important theme of her work. She died in Paris. Elaine de Kooning, also an abstract expressionist painter, was born in Brooklyn and was taught to draw early on and encouraged to visit museums by her mother. She finished her education with art courses in the late 1930s, and when she was about 20, she married Willem de Kooning. They left New York to teach at Black Mountain College during summer of 1948, and soon their marriage was a little bit shaky. And after her first solo exhibition in 1954, the couple split. The White House asked her for a portrait of Kennedy, and several renditions of Kennedy followed. One critic suggests she gained a place in history for painting male portraits. Her interests extended also to prehistoric caves in Spain and France, which she visited, and artistic inspirations to be gleaned from natural forms and animals. Portrait of a young man. This is a portion of that work. Another portrait of a man. And her one of her Kennedy paintings, John F. Kennedy in 1963. This work is, I believe, held at the Smithsonian Museum. Signature, I think, is at the bottom. There it is. Barnett Newman, famous for his zip paintings. About 1968, he became upset that Ashbery, in one of his critical works, had compared his painting to a work by Max Ernst. And the argument came up again later because he also wrote to Bill, William S. Rubin, who mentioned this, who was a curator at MoMA, to complain about the same comparison in a catalog to the show Dada Surrealism and Their Heritage. So Newman was upset with Ashbery. And I'm wondering if you notice anything about Newman in Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror. And I'm thinking if you don't notice, maybe you should. But we'll talk more about that a different time. Here's one of his paintings, a zip painting, and another. These paintings have lines that are vertical often in them. Alex Katz, born in New York, a figurative artist associated with pop art, painting and sculpture, and impressions, and portraits and landscapes were among his works. His first personal exhibit was at the Roco Gallery in the late 1950s. The Black Dress, a portrait of his wife Ada, helped him become better known in the early 1960s. Ashbery first met Katz at the August 1963 party that O'Hara hosted for him. So here's the Black Dress. Sorry, there's a series of Black Dress paintings, in fact, and this is one of them, and I apparently didn't get the number or date on this one. But if I remember right, there's maybe more than one painting in this series. Right, so just a reminder that some of this material can also be found in the book here, and you can consult that easily in most libraries.